So thank you so much for coming out. You're really in for a treat. Our next speaker is dynamic and just exudes kindness and caring about this really difficult and very important subject of race, class, and power in East Baltimore. I am a public school teacher and also a worker owner at Red Emma's, and for 7 years I taught in East Baltimore. I could see the Johns Hopkins Hospital out my classroom window. I taught at a school called Heritage High School in the Lake Clifton campus. And we had a really good thing going on. It was a neighborhood high school that just got kids who were put out of other places, but we were doing really good work with them and nurturing those students from what seemed like certain failure to college and good jobs and healthy families. And suddenly, a few years ago, it seemed like the city was trying to shut our school down. They removed our really excellent principal and a lot of our funding and put in a new principal who seemed to have an agenda that was not necessarily based around helping students. I was one of more than 20 experienced teachers who were let go in shady little ways. And I just drove past there at the beginning of this school year and saw that the placard on the front has the same font and the same logo as the My East Side Johns Hopkins stuff. And what they've done is they're land grabbing. But I'm not going to explain this. Marisela is going to explain this. Marisela is an amazing researcher and an amazing organizer. She's been working on this research for over 20 years. And the book, which is a product of more than 2 decades of research, is a phenomenal piece of work. So without further ado, Marisela Gomez.
Hello everyone. My name is Marisela. It's great to be here. I'm just checking you all out because you all have the opportunity to check me out. So I'm taking my time now to check you all out because once I start talking, I can go on forever. The book, Race, Class, Power, and Organizing in East Baltimore, Rebuilding Abandoned Communities in America. This book is it's a narrative about the process of how we rebuild communities that have been historically disinvested in the U.S. So just to give you a tiny history of how I came to write this. The process is I moved to Baltimore in 1990 to go to school at Hopkins, and had been doing some other work in organizing in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And in the process of arriving to Johns Hopkins East Baltimore campus, I was really taken with the disparity, the apparent disparity. So if anyone who here has driven around Hopkins East Baltimore complex, all right, so you are an informed audience. Awesome. Makes it even better. So imagine 24 years ago, 23 years ago. So I was very naive in thinking that Hopkins, an institution of such high caliber, prestige and history, actually participated in practicing what it preached and taught, and was a bit dismayed when I arrived in 1990 to find, not fully dismayed, all right, because I'm a woman of color in America. I know what oppression looks and feels and tastes like. But we all have hope eternal, and I have hope eternal. But what struck me when I arrived was that here was this bastion of education sitting in the midst of a disenfranchised community, primarily African American and low income, and a community that had been historically disinvested since it became poor and primarily of African descent. And here was this institution in the midst of it that had just continued to grow and proliferate itself. And it really took some time for me to decide to stay, number one, stay at Hopkins, and number two, to figure out how I was going to be able to survive there and not become part of the institution that had participated and contributed to the demise of its neighbors. And that was very intentional for me, because I didn't want to become part of this oppressive system. And in a way, oftentimes when we join institutions and organizations that have power, we unfortunately become them, and we become their soldiers of practice to continue themselves. Because, you go to an institution, you don't want them to fail when you get there. Right? So, in a way, in order to perpetuate yourself and your ego, you're invested in them continuing to be successful. But I wasn't that invested in Hopkins. And so, for me, it was a continuous struggle from the time I arrived to challenge and understand how they had participated in this community's demise. Because it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that one is getting richer and the other is getting more poor. And why is that? And what I came to understand is, like, if I could understand and figure out this relationship in this small area, I will understand the way America works. Because it's just a microcosm of what has happened in this country. And so that's been my life for the last 24 years. And out of that came this book. And the book talks about, it's divided into 3 parts: the past, the present, and the future. And what the past does is it describes how the East Baltimore community came to be what it was today, what it is today, what it was 5 or 10 years ago. The first part talks about the history of African Americans in East Baltimore, the perpetual disinvestment by the city and state of dollars for infrastructure, for housing, for healthcare, for the educational system, and how when you disinvest historically and chronically like that, what you basically have done is you have created decayed communities that you turn around and say the people there participated in the decay without looking at the systematic ways that they have been disinvested, while, say, a community right next to them that may be majority white, majority middle and higher income, somehow have managed to receive investment to allow their school system, their transportation system to proliferate and become bigger. So the first part's about the history, and specifically it's about the history of 2 big development projects that happened since the 1940s and 50s in East Baltimore, where one was a big expansion of Hopkins of about 59 acres, and it shows the first time that Hopkins expanded itself that much. And the way it did it, how did it come to do that? Well, it did it the way most universities and big institutions do. It partners with the powerful city or state representatives, it gets government dollars, and it displaces people from their land. So this whole gentrification and dispossession of people and place is not new. It's been going on for a very long time. In the 50s and 60s, we called it urban renewal. Now we use gentrification. We use revitalization. We use different names, but we're still doing the same thing. And Hopkins has been a really big participant in managing to collaborate with the powers that be, itself a very huge power. Now it's a company. Baltimore's a company town. And who's the company? Johns Hopkins. So in the 50s, that was its first large expansion. It was a displacement of more than 1,000 families, a housing project, primarily African Americans and low income. They were promised they'd have an opportunity to come back after the community was rebuilt, but no affordable housing was built, so they couldn't come back. That's how we still do it today. And so that's the first piece of the process of understanding why our communities look the way they do. And then the second big project was in the 60s, and that was another 50 acres. But this time Hopkins did not expand, so the community had more say in what happened. The community was organized, the civil rights movement was going on, there was a big emergence of black leadership in the US, and it changed the flavor of how rebuilding happened. But a big part of it, and a big part that we need to understand, is that Hopkins wasn't involved. So the city and the state didn't have to answer to two powers. They only had to answer to one, and that was the community, the people. And then it comes current to the early 2000s when Hopkins announced, and the city announced, another big project of rebuilding. That's 88 acres this time, just north of Hopkins. And this time, it would use eminent domain, which, as some of you may know, is the taking of private property, supposedly for public use, but it's been reinterpreted in practice. It's the taking of private property for private use, for private gain, and it can be anywhere from an institution like Hopkins taking land to build buildings and structures that make its members feel more comfortable, to building a football stadium, to building a shopping center, to building a high-rise complex. So the law of the 40s and 50s have been completely what's the way to say it nicely, demonized, and it's now being used to continue this inequity and power in our country. So in 2001, the city, our current governor, O'Malley, was then the city mayor, announced the redevelopment of 88 acres, and that was then the beginning of the current 88-acre Hopkins expansion that's occurring. The city was able to take the land of more than 800 families or households, again, primarily African American and low-income people. And look at the history, okay? It's another chronic displacement of people, a continued migration of people, forced migration of people from their land, from their community, from their social roots, from their social structures, all under the guise of these are communities that are so disinvested, what else can we do but remove them? But the other part we don't add is remove them and build it up for the expansion of some private interests that we as a community, as a people, feel are more worthy of that land. And so a lot of the book, though it's filled with a lot of the history and the data around how we do rebuilding, how racist and classist the system is, how we have allowed power to accumulate in the hands of the few. It takes a real stand on, because we have allowed ourselves to separate out as a group of people who are worthy, more worthy than others, to allow these things to occur. Because who would have thought that in 2001, the city of Baltimore would okay it that people would be forced to move so that a prestigious institution could expand itself? I mean, when you think about that, you think that kind of power, that kind of dictatorship, that kind of oppression only happens in countries that have, this cabal or this group of small people who run everything. But it's right here in Baltimore City, right here. Okay, right here we have the same kinds of systematic infrastructures and corrupt political systems so embedded that we can do that. That city mayor can say, yeah, we'll do this. We'll take the land and we'll, acquire the land, get the people off of it, and we'll then turn it over to Hopkins and we'll let them build a nice graduate student tower and build a Hopkins Bioethics Institute. I mean, I'm not quite sure why they named it that, but build housing and biotech building that, and also very importantly, is to get rid of the people who they feel are so different that it makes them uncomfortable. So I think this is a really big part, is if you read the book, take the details are important, but don't forget that what are the processes that allows us to continue these kinds of oppression today? What's the value and the moral system of our people, of our country, that allows the politicians and the people with power to continue to be able to practice these kinds of ill will against others? Why is that? How come we can still do that? How come we still demonize poor, low-income people of color to the extent that we feel it's okay to push them off their land because this other group of people seem to be more worthwhile and they can do better things with that land? Because that's what it comes down to, right? When you break it all down and you put all nice pieces away, that's the underpinning, that's the value system of a people that allows these things to happen. So how come in 2001 and currently it continues, the project is still 10 years away from being finished? How come we can still do that? And how do we participate in it? How do we as people, as consumers, demand a certain way of living, demand a certain lifestyle, demand to be next to people who we feel comfortable with, demand to not be around people we don't know because they make us uncomfortable? How do our own individual value system propagate a system that maintains that in place? So what I'm asking here is that we all have to hold ourselves accountable, right? So here's a book that lays out the detail, gives a specific example, a case study, if you will, of a project that happened that should never have happened, and that continues to happen, all under the guise of revitalization for the benefit of all. But that's completely false. I mean, I could use some other flavorful words to describe what that really means, but I'm not going to, because I think part of changing the dynamic of the system is to not use the rhetoric that they use against us. So if we want to be treated right, we have to treat everybody else right. Even when they oppress us and they treat us wrong, we still have to find the steadiness inside ourselves to rise above them, to redefine our value, to not take the value of the oppressor into ourselves. Another big part of the book is about organizing, because someone did mention that I do some organizing. So that's the other big part of me is, even though I attended Hopkins and became an observer and a participant while I was there, I continued to do a lot of grassroots organizing in the community. It's the way I got to know the members of Middle East Baltimore so well, and learned and shared people's stories and lives. And so what I detail in the book too is the history of organizing in East Baltimore, and how when people were organized was when they could challenge Hopkins and the city and the state government and the federal dollars and where they were going. And that when people were not organized was when the city and Hopkins had carte blanche to just take the property. So in the 1950s project, the first big expansion of Hopkins of 59 acres, where more than 1,000 families were displaced, The community was not organized. It was in the 50s, so the revolution had not started yet, or had not happened, at least that one. And so people didn't have that power. Black people in America didn't have that power yet. And so when they first announced in the newspaper that this project would result in the first gardens, the first new buildings being built for the Negro, quote, it was a wonderful thing. Everybody was happy. Folks were okay to leave, to let them take their land, because they thought that they would be displaced temporarily into the community next door and then come back into those new garden-style apartments. But that didn't happen after people were displaced into communities that were no better than the ones they were being displaced out of. They changed the plan. The land sat vacant for 4 years. They went back, Hopkins and the city went back to the city council, and they decided that they weren't going to build those apartments for the Negro. They were going to build it for the Hopkins community, the guests and the visitors and the students. And not one building was built for people who had initially lived there. And all the businesses that were there had to move because the people who were moving in didn't want that product, because that product was for the people who originally lived there. And so that's how you get displacement. That's how you get gentrification. That's kind of the ingredients, if you will, of oppressive displacement. In the second project, people were organized. It was the 60s. Things were changing. People had just seen what happened 10 years previous. The promises, they knew they couldn't trust the city. They knew Hopkins was really not their friend, even though there was a lot of rhetoric that they were there to serve. And they were organized, and they went to the city council and they said this has to be for the people, by the people. And so there were groups, there were coalitions, and it had a different result. And again, a big part, and I think this can't be a small piece of it, is that this was the land Hopkins didn't want. So they didn't have to struggle with the giant in this one. In the current project in 2000, when it was first announced, the community was not organized either. And that's the one that I was fully involved with as an organizer, and eventually as the executive director of the organization. It was first announced, no one was organized, and they assumed that people would just leave like sheep. They just assumed that folks had no voice, they had no agency, and the majority of the people found out they had to move through the newspaper, to the Baltimore Sun. Now, how would you imagine if that was you, and you found out in the newspaper that your land was going to be taken, not sure when, for expansion for a biotech park of Hopkins, but all you knew is that you had to go. This is the level of disrespect that this mayor and his administration and this grand prestigious institution had for the people of East Baltimore. But then what happened? Community organized, and it changed things, and it demanded equity, and it demanded that this couldn't happen that way, that people had to be treated fairly, that people had to be reimbursed for their homes at a market value instead of the value that they were going to give to them, that they couldn't do demolition of houses right across from where people were living so that lead dust could just go right into their houses without them even knowing about it, and that they had to build housing for low-income people. And so an organization formed and demanded justice and held people accountable. And it was through this process of organizing, and that came out of the blue, came out of a community that they had sort of left for dead and felt would just kind of walk away without a challenge. This is what came, and this is what changed the process. Brought more people to the table, held them accountable, resulted in legislation being passed that said there had to be at least a third affordable housing, that changed the market, how much money people would get from their houses. They were trying to give people the money for relocation that was set in legislation in the 50s and 60s without any increase for cost of living since then. And it was only when they were challenged that was illegal and unethical and of poor value that they actually rethought that. Yeah. The system won't change unless you push it. The system will not change unless you push it. The system will not change unless you push it. And the only reason that you can think that the system will change when you don't push it is if you have privilege and power. Because see, when you have privilege and power, the system knows that it can't do the things that it would want to do because they know they'll get pushback. It doesn't really matter really because, you know, when you do certain things in certain communities, most of those people in the privileged community are part of the process of change anyway. They're on the boards, you know, they're on the you know, they have community groups whose members are on this board, they know that board, they know this developer, they know that builder. So it's sort of the same group of people making the changes. But when you do processes like community building in disinvested and abandoned, historically abandoned communities, people who are poor and without power, you're dealing with people who are different from you, right? So it's easy to distinguish yourself as different. And because as humans we have a lot of ego, it's also easy to think that you're better than and that you're more worthy than. And so when you're dealing in these kinds of power and no power situation, it's only when you push the system to do right by you that the system will do right by you. There's never been change without push. It just doesn't happen. And when it does happen, again, it's in communities that already have power because they're part of the system. And so when the community was organized, it challenged the process and it changed it. Currently now it's 12 years into the current project in East Baltimore. The project has not delivered as it said, even though there's legislation currently in the City Hall for affordable housing. There's still has not been built any low-income affordable home ownership. There's some there's rental, some low-income rental, but no ownership. There's not a current community organized. There's not a powerful current organized community. One of the things when you displace people, you displace the social networks, you displace the organizations. So the majority of the people that were part of the organization were displaced, and therefore the community association is not there anymore. So when you don't have that community to challenge and push back, it's easy to run over. And so we continue to observe and assess the lack of practice of consistency of promises. So I'm gonna make a few more remarks, and then I'm going to invite discussion and questions. I think an important part of this is for us to really acknowledge that there's a humongous power imbalance that exists in our country. It exists in the world, right? And we practice out in the world against other countries that are not as powerful as the Americas. The reason we do it because we learned how to do it at home. But we don't call it that at home. So you have institutions like Hopkins, that is held. And by the way, I did finish Hopkins, and so it's not like I got kicked out. Although I'm surprised I didn't. But I did complete my stay there because I usually finish what I started. But it was a difficult ride. And why was it difficult? Because there is such a power imbalance. And when you go into a system, it's easy for you. But not only do they do not make it easy for you, but it unravels your own very soul when you stay too long. And I think one of the reasons that we get sometimes stuck is that sometimes we don't take care of ourselves enough to, one, challenge that unraveling, or two, get the heck out when you need to survive your mental state. So we have to remember that what the United States United States practices outside of its borders, it learned from being inside here. And the history of slavery and oppression of Native Americans and all the other disenfranchised groups, it's like there's great training. There's a lot of training has happened. It's like there's been a certain kind of training in this country. And this is the training. It looks pretty now. You know, we make it nice. We put frills on it. It's sharp. It's the iPhone. So we make it pretty. We make it acceptable. And what we do as consumers is we gobble it down. But we can't for too long keep forgetting that until we retrain ourselves, so when we get into those systems, if we choose to make that our path of struggle, that we can maintain ourselves, not unravel, and continue to change them. Because there's nothing else to do in this world than to change the system. Because it's a system that continues to oppress and separate us. And as long as we stay separated and fragmented, we can never be whole. Just take anything, I don't know who bakes here, I like to bake. The cake only tastes good when you put all the ingredients together. Otherwise, it's just flour and baking powder and salt and a little bit of sugar. But when you bring it together and you make it whole, when you mix it up, the mezcla, the mix, that's when it's beautiful and it's tasty. And so, as long as we continue to separate ourselves, as long as we continue to live in a system that worships consumerism, the god of production, a capitalist state, one that separates us and steps on those, finds the weakest link to exploit, we'll continue to have this kind of power and disempowered, and it's only going to continue to grow. And so I challenge you, all y'all who are from Baltimore area. I'm a what do you call it? I didn't grow up here, but I'm staying, and nobody's going to kick me out. And it's not that people haven't tried, but we're here for the long haul. And I would challenge you to do what I've done, is pick a system that you're familiar with and study it. Study how it came to be powerful or how it came to be not so powerful. And I guarantee you that you will find all the ingredients of why we have fractured, separated systems right now. And when you figure it out, you figure out what your role is to change it. But don't forget that it's going to have to start with you, because that's what I learned the hard way. Was it's fine to do a lot of organizing and it's fine to step out myself, but until I figured out how to deal with me and how I'm going to change all the oppressive forces that had come into me and that I had taken on and become angry and oppressive myself, because we do that too. We're always stepping in one role or the other. We're not just one or the other. We share. It's like we walk with power and we walk without. So it's only when we look at how we manifest and how we materialize and practice with that and figure out how to change it, and then take that wisdom and that insight and bring it into the work of change. And study your institutions. The book is great because it gives you a real good example of an institution that has built its power partly on the backs of the poor. And that's what America is. It's built its power on the backs of the poor and the disenfranchised. But it doesn't have to continue to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. And the more we educate ourselves and understand and teach our kids and our loved ones and those we don't love also, that it doesn't have to, then it will change. So I'll stop there and invite questions.
You mentioned pushing back. I'd like to hear more about pushing back against the neoliberals in power, especially since these same officials are, in nearly all cases, in the pay of the developers that profit from this gentrification.
Yeah. So So first of all, I don't have all the answers. But secondly, right, pushing back. So how do we push back? Well, one is we find community and we organize. Right? I mean, that's been a staple of the history of the country and of other countries. We find like-minded people to nourish us, to take refuge in, and to develop and build our ideas. I mean, very practically, to the book and to the work there, that's what we did. You know, people came together and said enough was enough. People came together and said there was no lack of evidence at this point. It was clear that the people at B, the powers of B, the Hopkins, the city, the state, had shown them in a very practical way what they thought of them by saying that they would just take their land and not even have the decency to have a meeting to invite them to ask about, what do you want to participate? Do you want to live here? So people came together. They found their common struggle. They found, and I think this is something that we haven't figured out how to do yet. You know, we have disparate struggles. It comes back to the separation. We have more power together as a people, as all people, than we have separately. Now, I've been involved in a whole lot of struggles in my lifetime, different kinds of struggles. And what I've learned is that they're all separate. And they almost compete with each other. So this pushback has to come from a common base. So those who are struggling for community rights, those who are struggling against the prison industrial complex, those who are struggling against the academic industrial complex, yeah, right, because that's there too, and we got to push back on that nonsense, right? And the non-profit industrial complex, yeah, because that needs to be taken, and we got one of the biggest one, Casey Foundation, right here in our backyard. How does that big amount of power determine and make our lives dependent on them? So the pushback has to come with organizing. You know, we can't do anything without organizing as a people, as a struggle, as a powerful base. It doesn't mean that each one of us has to do all those different struggles. But what it needs is that, I mean, I think this is where it comes back to the ethic and the spirit and the value of what we say we're doing. If we're really anti-capitalist, then we find that common denominator in all our struggles. And then when we have that big rally, we know our brothers and sisters will come out and be there for us. Doesn't mean they have to be at every single meeting, but they'll come out and they'll join us when we need them. So there's pushback in the organized state. I mean, we got to start training each other and beating each other to be the new political leaders. This is a big part. You know, the cronyism that's in government has to be taken out. I mean, there's no other way about it. We've got people in power who have sold out the communities again and again and again. It's not like once last year they made a funny vote on that issue, so maybe we can give them a chance. No, look at their voting history, folks. But we keep re-electing them. We keep putting, you know, we have to take people out. I don't mean it in the... Honestly, I don't. I really don't mean it that way. But I mean we have to disempower them. We have to disempower the people who have power. And we have to find the weak links to do that. And a big part of pushing back, I think, is we got to look at ourselves as consumers. You know, we are such a consumer society, and our consumerism feeds the system of power. Every time someone goes out and get a new edition of the iPhone. Obviously, I don't have an iPhone, but I do have a smartphone because I'm not that smart. But we're consumerism. Our consumerism, you know, like people ask me, you know, white middle class people, students from Hopkins ask me, are you telling me I shouldn't live in Middle East Baltimore now because the land's tainted? Well, the old part of me would say, yeah, you need to get on out of there. But now I don't feel like that. What I feel like is, what you got to do is you got to figure out how to be with people in a way where you're not oppressing them and you're not perpetuating a system that have brought about the change that's there. I mean, to me, that's a pushback. To me, if every individual one of us takes our responsibilities seriously and look at how we're consuming and we're perpetuating the system. As far as I'm concerned, as long as we keep wanting to go to these institutions of ivory tower and all that, we're perpetuating those systems. We're saying, I value your values and I want to go there. Now, I'm going to say this because I think this is important. When I came to Hopkins, I was in New Mexico, Albuquerque, and someone said you should go to Hopkins. I had no clue what a Hopkins was. I said, what's a Hopkins? I had no value for this kind of ivory tower-ish, power people. This is where you need to be. But one of the reasons I came and I stayed was I wanted to understand. Like what I said once was, I want to see if they put their clothes on the same way I put my clothes on, because they acted like they put their clothes on different than people like me. So I figured the only way I could find that out was to just get on up in there and watch them put their clothes on. So what I'm saying is, you want to push back. If you get in the system, you got to get in the system to change it. There is no reason to get into a system without an intention to change the system, because the systems are corrupt. That's pushback. Every single day, what you do, and to be nice to people, I think that's a pushback too, because I think the proliferation and production is based on a system of being mean and exploitive, and that takes away from our humanity and our compassion and our kindness. And so pushback is to start to be kinder, to listen more. That goes against everything that a system of production says, because production means fast, let's get it done, we don't have time to be nice. So we want to push back every day, just be nice too. There's a lot of ways to push back. I'm going to stop there.
Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. Quick question, and you started to touch on it. I know that some of the foundations in the city have been very heavily invested in the East Baltimore project, and I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of foundations in East Baltimore.
Yeah, so I was looking at you thinking, how much should I say? So specifically, the Annie Casey Foundation has been a big leader on this, and certainly in my presentations and my discussions about this, I hold them partly accountable for the way this has gone on. Why do I say that? Because they came in and they leveraged themselves. They leveraged their reputation. They initially, when this project started, Hopkins has a reputation in the community for being a big bully, for taking advantage, because it's been doing it for years. There's much history. The elders in the community taught me what Hopkins was to them. It's a plantation. What the Casey Foundation and other foundations have done was it brought in their nice, reputable, and it's not that I believe that they're nice and reputable, but they're nice and reputable selves. And they made it seem like, because they were at the table now co-leading this project, that now it was a good thing, right? So that's my short answer to what I think of the foundations and all this. They should be held accountable.
Hello, I'm from El Paso too. I was hearing you say you're from Albuquerque. One of the things that I found really astonishing is I came to a program here called Micah Place, and it was specifically to work in East Baltimore. And when I got here, I was shocked because I'm from backward Texas, right? and the way people would talk about East Baltimore to me, if I didn't know what I was doing, I'd be scared. People spoke about people from East Baltimore, which is shocking to me. And I was just wondering, because I think we have to make those connections. Red Emma was in El Paso, Flores Marron, Ruben Salazar. We have to start to make those connections, because gentrification on the border is going on now too. But I just thought that with this reputation Texas has, and the way things were supposed to be more aggressive in the Northeast, what just seemed to me telling me when they fear 200-300 murders a year in Baltimore, when in Juarez it's a good year you had 1,300, then you start to know what it's like to live without powerless in a powerless society when you're just trying to maneuver, trying to live your life. But I was shocked, just having been a transplant here, and I've been here like a month, the way people speak about East Baltimore.
Do you want to just say what that is?
The way they speak about it?
Yeah.
Like if I was naive to come here, like I should be in fear, like I don't belong, like what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve is naive. Well, maybe I should explain the program. It's all about going into community, doing community art, helping the community kind of help itself organize. And I'm still conflicted about being part of an institution, but being there to help. And that's what I came here.
Yeah, I was just having a conversation with someone before this presentation about exactly what you said. It kind of links to what I said earlier, which is when we go into institutions. So let me make it clear. Micah went into Middle East Baltimore the same way Hopkins was doing it, right? Meaning without consulting with the community, right? And why is that? Because there's a precedent set about how you go into poor, disenfranchised community. It comes back to the powerlessness. You know, if you see someone is not having power, you feel you can go and exert yours. So Micah went in with its Micah Place in the same way without consulting the community to be there, just to set the record straight. Why? Well, it's an institution, it has power. Now, as participants in the institution, how do we manifest ourselves, right? How do we interact? Especially when you hear that stuff. It's the same thing, I think, of a little bit of what I said earlier, is, you know, if you're in there to change it, I believe every institution has a role to co-opt the people who come into it. Like I said earlier, is institutions they think that we're their children. They want us to propagate themselves. It's like they're producing little babies of them. And every parent wants their babies to be just like them, right? So we have to make decisions when we go into institutions, whether it's Micah or Hopkins or Casey or any of the institutions. And we're just talking here. You can find all these players, by the way, in every city in America, okay? So I'm picking on Hopkins in this one because it's the one I know. But many of you have the history in other places, and I see you shaking your head. You can mimic what I'm saying. It's the same thing. If you go into the institutions, especially that have such power and that have participated in the demise of the communities, I think those are the questions you ask, and I think those are the ways that you are able to challenge that. You know, instead of telling people that they're the cause of it, asking them, you know, how did Hopkins participate? How did Micah participate? Did Micah do it any differently? And then how do you manifest and what kind of child of Micah are you going to be? Are you going to be a child that mimics your ancestors, or are you going to try to do it differently? And doing it differently is number one, challenging those stereotypes. And when you meet the community, being humbly and respectful for all the experience that community has and the knowledge that community has, and lifting that up in the process, and letting the community be not a subject but an equal participant in that process. I think if we all did that in institutions, I mean, we're changing it already. But we don't do that because that's not what the powers that be do, because it takes too long. And they don't have the money to fund it, and you know, it's just not. People in power are used to privilege and doing things the way they're used to, and we just have to shake that up. We just have to go in there and take risks, be willing to be fired, be willing to be expelled. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one more long Marisela answer, or too more short, Marisela?
Too short.
Okay.
Just stop me. You know.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Sarah. So you don't want to be one of them? Okay. So we've got a couple over here. Anybody else want to ask one? We'll take a couple of questions and then we'll let you respond to all of them at the same time.
So I'm not exactly sure if I know you brought up the point about organizing. So I actually, I'm from Baltimore City, and my first home was the Lexington Terrace high-rise that's on Martin Luther King Boulevard, and it was torn down like decades ago. But there was a lot of, I know within my community, there was a lot of talk and a lot of, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But I don't think I actually kind of heard how that kind of like indigenous community organizing like works on that kind of level for you.
So we're going to get a couple more. That's an awesome question.
Congratulations about your book, and I'm coming from California, and I just recently I was helping a Mexican professor, Dr. Octavio Pescador, and he was running for city council to try to change things, to make things better for the Latinos and for the black community. Well, the university, UCLA, decided to give it back and not help him, to support him, not with money, not with nothing. Even if he's working for them for 15 years, he's been teaching, doing things for the university. But as soon as they hear these Latinos running for city council, they not support him, they not help him. And this is sad to see someone comes with $500,000 to run a campaign for city council where the councilmen make around $125,000 a year. It's crazy, and the way things done, and definitely we need to get organized and get together. But the things is happen not only here in Los Angeles and different places in the country.
It's astounding what you and the people of Middle East Baltimore accomplished, and we need a lot more of this across the country. I do have a question, and that is, was there ever any hope of stopping the demolitions entirely or limiting them before you had to move on to working on getting a decent deal for the people who were being displaced?
So the two questions about organizing and stopping kind of go together. So I mentioned eminent domain was used, which is a law that allows the city to take property, and if it says that the area is so run down, it can. So the stickler there was that the area was already designated an urban renewal area, which already means that it's deteriorated, unfortunately. Whether it is or not, it was already. So the next step then was how to get so much land and do so much demolition. So using the powers of eminent domain allowed them to do that. So how does that happen? City council members of that area have to put it in and suggest that happen. And so the two city councilmen, the city councilman and the city councilwoman, Paula Johnson Branch and Bernard Jack Young, who are currently representing, agreed to allow eminent domain to be used to take the property. Did the community resist that? Heck yes. So this was how the organizing occurred. Started in a church, 100 people, right? Decided enough was enough. Started just collecting names of people who were there. There was a decision by that group of people that this had to stop, and just grassroots organizing, taking people names. People were assigned to call one another, have another meeting next week. Okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to ask for? Trying to get meetings with city council people, trying to get meetings with the mayor, trying to get meetings with the city planning people, trying to get meetings with the designers, just starting a process that wasn't there, going to the media, writing letters. When they had the actual council hearing, where the properties that were going to be, of those 800 properties, actually it was more, 1,200 properties that were going to be taken, they had to go down a list of all those properties. People who lived in those properties went up and testified. This is my property. I've put money into this. I've improved it. How can you just take it? And this was at the time when they were just going to give minimal amount. Now just imagine they were going to give something like $30,000 for a piece of property that was going to become, redevelopment area, probably like $300,000 or $200,000, right? This was the respect. And I like to use respect because I think it's important. So people got up there and testified. I did an addition to my house. People would say, it doesn't matter. You shouldn't do an addition to an area that's in urban renewal and disinvested. I mean, this is real stuff, right? Happening in the community. And organizing people to get up and testify. Meeting with Paula Johnson Branch and Bernard Jack Young when they would have us, who would tell us in private, yeah, but then in the end voted that eminent domain would take the property. And then that organized, so now people have asked why wasn't it challenged legally? And that's a good question, right? What needs to be said here is that, at least in my understanding, residents of East Baltimore have never said that the community was not needing rebuilding and reinvestment. So people aren't blind, they're wise. They know, they've been asking for years for reinvestment. What they always said was, we want to be a part of it. So it wasn't that they wanted to stop the process, they wanted to be a part of the process. They wanted to help design what the homes would look like. SMAC, when we first formed, the actual grassroots organizing, I remember this, on Saturday, 5-10 people in a van with a blowhorn driving down the street, asking people to come out, knocking on doors. Do you know this is happening? 2, do you want to stay? 3, do you want to be a part of it? 4, here's a meeting, come out and let's talk about it. This was it from scratch. Even informing people. We'd knock on doors and people didn't have a clue that this was going on. Because part of being this abandoned and disinvested community is that you don't participate. There's no community whole anymore. And so there's no real way to get information about what's happening in your community. And this fragmentation is what allows these communities to be taken advantage of. And so people were like, 60-70% of folks, the doors we knocked on, said, yeah, we want to stay. We want to be a part of this. And here's the kind of housing we want. So all that grassroots organizing, we turned over. This is what made the organizing so powerful. It wasn't a group of outsiders like myself and others coming in and saying, we think this is a good deal for you. No, we were just facilitators. It was the community that met and said, and it was a very practical project. The board always had to be a majority local residents, area residents. There always had to be a majority. There always had to be a process where the president, vice president, 3 out of 4 officers were local residents. So not only were we organizing to find out what people wanted, we were organizing to build leadership capacity. And that was something also that was new. And we were also very transparent because people certainly weren't being transparent with how they were treating folks. And so one of the mottos of SMEA, the organization, Save Middle East Action Committee, was transparency. Everything, people had to be transparent. No closed door meetings with any of these powerful people, because it's when they get these closed door meetings that they make deals. And then they step, and this is what started to happen at the end of the organization's lifetime, is the I would have closed door meetings with a resident, make promises, and now it started to fracture the community, right? So all the practices of power and how to keep separating was occurring. So I hope that answers both your questions. And I hear you, the gentleman from California. All I can say is yeah.
So thank you so much, Marisela, and thank you all for coming out. And please stick around. Marisela will be signing books in the back, and you can continue to talk with her there.